Schufro, who is listed on the agenda. Joel has a serious back problem right now and couldn't attend today. He played a leading role as executive director of NICOSH in organizing this conference. I'm very sorry he can't be here to preside and to participate. All right. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Cheers, Joel. All right. Thank you so much. Great.
You're on the stage.
Very good. Okay. Today's conference, in its essence, is a conference about public health, as a number of speakers have said. Public health incorporates emergency response for natural and man-made disasters, how to deal with occupational and environmental stressors, protection from infectious disease, how to deal with disparities in access to healthcare services, how to reform a broken healthcare system that urgently needs reform. So it seems to me it's most appropriate that our final speaker of the day is the president of the American Public Health Association. Dr. Linda Ray Murray has spent her career of over 40 years serving the medically underserved. For decades, she has served as an occupational physician in the U.S. and in Canada. She served as chief medical officer for primary care for the Ambulatory and Community Health Network of the Cook County Bureau of Health Services outside of Chicago, or in Chicago. And she's on leave now as chief medical officer of the Cook County Department of Public Health. I'd like to introduce our friend and president of the American Public Health Association, Dr. Linda Ray Murray.
Good afternoon. I want to, when I was flying in this morning to New York City and arrived here and saw this room full of people carefully paying attention to today's events, it's really a privilege for me to have joined you today and to sit and listen to the tremendous work that this community has done in the past decade just to win some, as our previous speaker said, crumbs. The amount of work that it took to do that. This is not the first time that workers and people living in communities have been murdered in this country. This is New York City, right? Y'all believe in, like, frank talk, right? Okay. You know, when you're lied to, when things happen that didn't have to happen, when deliberate decisions are made to not act, and it costs people's lives, we call that murder. And the sad thing is that most of us in this country do not think about murders that have happened previously. NICOSH celebrated or memorialized, it wasn't really a celebration, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire 100 years ago. Locked in a factory floor, burned to death, murder. We've had workers before enter a workplace, breathe in dust, and drop dead quickly. Gawley Bridge. It's not as though we don't know about these kinds of events. 9/11 represents something more than that, though. And so I want to take some time for us to reflect on what it represents. You know, I was in Chicago at my government job on 9/11, seeing patients on the south side of Chicago. And as you've heard, I am an occupational physician by training. And as I watched over the next several days events unfold on the site, I and my granddaughter, who, by the way, had no training, said, "That's a mess down there." That's dangerous down there. It's not like it took industrial hygienists to clearly identify that things were bad. And it's easy when people force you into a series of actions and positions and don't let you step back and think about what's really going on. I don't know if you remember, but I was struck by one of the slides earlier that talked about the immediate cost, not the cost that the brother that just left the stage is facing. The immediate cost of 9/11 in the past 10 years, $5 billion on workers and the community, $25 billion for physical damage, and $123 billion on loss for interrupted business. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we better remember some other costs of 9/11, because lying to the people of New York was not the only cost. In the past 10 years, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, we have spent $2.7 trillion. That makes the money that you've grudgingly won to support people's health not even a footnote. It's not even loose change. $2.7 trillion, 224,000 people killed directly because of war actions of our government. More than that dead from just the impact of war on those countries. 365,000 wounded, 7.8 million people displaced. Because our concept, our government's concept of the appropriate response was not to reach out and value human health, not to design policies and procedures or responses that were focused and directed and rational. They put their politics over taking care of business. And that's why here 10 years later, we have buildings that are not completely clean and workers that are dying. Now, some of this pain and suffering is really unnecessary. Even though I am an occupational health and safety professional like many in this room, I also just practice as an ordinary doc. And if you got a hungry child, it's important to find out why they're hungry. Don't get me wrong. But the immediate cure for a hungry child is food. If you got someone that's cold and homeless, I'm not suggesting that we don't investigate and think about why they're cold and homeless. But you can give them a house to live in. And when you have people that are sick, you shouldn't worry about how much time they spent on the pile, what block they lived on, were they within this boundary or that boundary. If they're sick, they're human beings. They deserve the best care we can give them. And what we have to understand is that the people who run this country have different values, I think, than most of the people who live in the country. You see, I think that most of the people who live in this country use basic common sense. And when we live in such a rich country and we cannot even provide health care for children, we can't provide health care for our seniors. When we have elected officials suggesting that the ability of our seniors to buy food is a Ponzi scheme, are we really surprised that it takes so long to get a few crumbs to deal with this national disaster? When all of the eyes of the world were focused on New York City and you still can't get care for people that responded to the call for help? What were we doing on that pile in week 2 or week 3 when we knew there was no one alive? This wasn't just a miscalculation. This was a statement of values by people who run our country. And they valued the appearance of return to normal and the guarantee that they would not lose money. That's what they valued, above the workers on the pile, the children that return to school, the families that return to their homes. This conference is an important conference. It was very interesting. But I want to remind you, we have to separate the scientific questions, which are important. You see, to analyze why the buildings collapse, that's important because we build buildings all the time. To think about what exposures were there is important because sometime, some other place, there'll be an exposure similar. These questions that were raised here today are important questions. But the broad outlines are clear. Any well-trained worker knows that OSHA standards aren't safe. That's not news or a surprise. The question was not really, do the air levels meet OSHA standards? And by the way, I don't believe they did. I'd like to see it. But anyway, I'll leave that alone. That's the wrong question. The question people want to know is, what is this air going to do to me? Now, I agree that oftentimes us doctors and scientists, we don't know the answer. There's nothing wrong with saying we don't know. We don't necessarily even have the solutions. People get sick and we can't do anything about it. That, unfortunately, is the case with so many people that had these exposures. What's not acceptable is to try to cover your ass. That's just not acceptable. Now, you know, I haven't always worked for government, but most of my career has been in the public sector. And the way I look at it, we're responsible for whatever happens. And covering your ass is a useless activity. Because if the people can't blame me, the public health department, for failing to protect their health, who are they supposed to blame? So I think people get caught up in the wrong questions. What would have happened if that part of Manhattan had been declared a Superfund site? What would have happened? It just cost more money. A rounding error in that $2.7 trillion we spent on the war. We have to remember our training as labor activists, as community activists, as professionals, that what questions get asked and who asks the questions are the first step in what answers you get. So if the question being asked is, how can New York City look like it's functioning? How can we make sure that the economy is not disrupted? You get the answers you got. Are we ready for another 9/11? Hell no. Were we ready for Katrina? Were we ready for these tornadoes? Were we ready for the hurricanes? No, we're not ready. We weren't ready for H1N1. If I could tell you how many pandemic flu plans we have around the country, and we're not ready, not because of planning, though bad planning doesn't help, okay? But we don't have the resources. We allow our infrastructure to disappear. We don't normally enforce OSHA standards. OSHA doesn't even cover everybody. No, we're not ready. We're not serious. Brothers and sisters, y'all are New Yorkers, so I'm going to say something here. Work with me. The only time today that I was a little disturbed, I was angry all day, but the only time today I was a little disturbed about what I was hearing was when people said, the problem is the government. Now, I wasn't taking it personally, even though I work for the government. A lot of y'all work for the government, I know. The firefighters worked for the government. The police worked for the government. The school teachers, most of them, work for the government. How many of y'all pay taxes? We are the government. The problem is not the government. Now, you see, our enemies have a long-range view. You and me, we go about trying to do our business, go to work, play with our kids, play with our grandkids, you know, have a nice life. But our enemy doesn't think like that. They have a long-term view. They have complicated plans. And so they have convinced even people in this room that the problem is the government. These elected officials get elected by people like you and me. Well, some of them aren't like you and me, but anyway, they get elected by people. Those of us that work in government get hired by people. We carry out the rules and regulations and policies of the folks you and I elect. The problem is not the government. The problem is we've allowed our government to be hijacked. Resources centers who in the past couple of decades have trained the vast majority of health and safety experts in the country. These are the institutions that allow Mount Sinai and Bellevue to offer excellent care. When they are zeroed out in the budget, and it's not clear to me they're going to exist in 2 or 3 years, we're not serious about being prepared. And our enemies think long term. They undermined this stuff decades ago. Do you think it's an accident? Let me tell you, even industrial hygienists that work for companies don't like working with standards that are 40 years old, 50 years old. You think that's an accident? Do you really believe the shit they tell you that the government workers in OSHA just sat on their asses for 40 years and just didn't want to make any new standards? No. You fought and fought and fought for a standard, and then it gets reversed on the one you get through every 10 years. This is not a surprise, and we should be ashamed to act as though it's a surprise. And we need to make sure that our anger is directed in the right place. I have no problem holding a bureaucrat responsible. I don't even have a problem yelling at the government officials when they come in. I don't have a problem with that at all. I get yelled at all the time. The question is, do we understand what's really going on? We've allowed our government, federal, state, local, to be hijacked by a small group of people that are using the government for their benefit. That's why Social Security suddenly is a Ponzi scheme. That's why you can't raise taxes. It's impossible to raise taxes. That's why the class size in our kids' school is going up. That's why the SAT score is the lower it's been in 30 years. That didn't happen overnight or last year. That started 20 years ago with the constant undermining of the resources we need to protect ourselves on the job and to keep our communities safe. This is the lesson that we should have learned a long time ago. I'm not interested. I'm so tired of these debriefings on the lessons of this. We always knew that the police and fire, how many policemen, y'all know police and fire don't talk to each other normally when they're in the same room. I'm just here to tell you, you know. When I go to my emergency training, I said my goal is just to duck when the police and fire are fussing at each other. I mean, they're both great, but you know, that's the truth, okay? That's not the problem, or certainly not a mystery. It's not, they didn't know that they had different phones and different walkie-talkies. Everybody knows that. It's not a mystery that we don't understand what happens when that kind of explosion occurs. Shit, we don't understand what happens when we make steel. And we've been making that for centuries. So what happens when different chemicals come together is beyond our understanding. It's a major scientific challenge for us. Fortunately, in public health, we're just doctors. We're not really scientists. See, that's an important difference. If you came to see me in my office and you had a fever and chills and a cough, most of our offices wouldn't even take a chest x-ray. But let's say I was feeling good and took a chest x-ray that day. If I waited for scientific proof that you had pneumococcal pneumonia, 30% of you would be dead before I got around to giving you the right antibiotic. And you all should sue me for malpractice. I'm a physician. If I have somebody that looks like they got pneumonia, walks like they got pneumonia, coughs like they got pneumonia, I take my appropriate tests, but I start treatment. That's what we do in public health. We don't have to figure out, is this cancer related to the exposures on the World Trade Center? Well, first of all, if we had universal health care, it wouldn't matter. You would get your health care taken care of. And you would get your health care taken care of even if you were here without the proper documents. In public health, now the scientists, put all the precautionary principle. That's important to learn. You might need it, if you go testify for Congress. But this is just this is just common sense that your grandmother taught you, In public health, if we see a problem, we figure it out the best way we can. But you try to put in a solution before your people die. Now, sometimes you'll be wrong. Sometimes you'll honestly think something is safe when it's not. But in my experience, if you're honest with people, and if you do the best you can, and if you're not always protecting the folks with the money, they understand that in an emergency, you can... In that emergency, some people went up instead of going down. They made a mistake. It cost them their lives. But they weren't just sitting there. They weren't being malicious. It would be shocking to me in this whole scenario. I didn't know exactly what mistake, but I know sitting and watching it, I said, I know people are making mistakes. But are they honest mistakes? Are they mistakes that are designed to save people's lives? Sometimes you make a judgment, it's the wrong judgment. We're not ready. And in fact, I would suggest to you that we are in worse shape today than we were 10 years ago. Not because we didn't successfully pass some legislation. Don't misunderstand me. Not even because we haven't revised how, let's say, the federal government responds to emergencies. I think the response to the Gulf oil disaster was much better. Not enough, but much better than what happened in 9/11. I'm not suggesting that there aren't small improvements, but we're in worse shape because 40% of your local health departments have cuts and furlough days. I work for the government even on the days when I'm on a furlough day and they don't pay me. Some days they pay me. We're not ready because we're undercutting our school system. We're not ready because most of your state labs that are designed to analyze anthrax and weird chemical combinations are underfunded and closing. We're not ready because the bridges that you need to escape from certain places are unstable and in poor repair. These problems don't happen overnight. And we must not be asleep at the wheel when we talk about how to become ready. When I went to Madison, when they were having their difficulties with their governor, they had a chant that made sense to me. They said, "This is our house." Well, damn it, this is our government. It doesn't work very well. It's not working for us enough. It's like every 10th day, I think they may work for us. But it's our government. And we have to seize control of it and put in place what we need to keep ourselves and our neighbors healthy. And what we need to do that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in 10 years. It hasn't changed in 100 years. It hasn't changed in 400 years. What we need to do that means that we have to have justice. Not just for people with money, but for everyone. Whether you're a unionized worker or a non-union worker. And in fact, one of the basic measures of justice is how many of us are unionized. We're below 10%. We're in trouble. In order to be ready, we have to have justice, and that means that all of our children have to be able to learn how to read and write. That we have to create the conditions that allow everyone to live a decent life. And that our health and our life shouldn't be determined by whether we're a man or a woman, whether we're an immigrant or black, what zip code we live in, or how much our pocketbook is worth. If we're serious about being better prepared for the next 9/11, we better understand that a 9/11 happens every year. While we've been meeting here, 12 workers died in this country. 12 workers die each and every day in this country, and each year that's more than the number of people that died on 9/11. Don't be fooled. Don't be bamboozled. What we need to do is what you all have done for the past decade. We need to come together. We need to organize. We need to take back our government because we're fighting for our lives. Thank you.